This story takes place on a late-night train cutting through the countryside, a place where most people expect nothing more than silence and the steady sound of wheels on steel. But for one passenger, the journey turned into something far darker as whispers filled the carriages and shadows refused to leave. It is a tale about Laura, an ordinary traveler who discovered that some passengers never truly step off the train once they board. If you enjoy chilling stories told in a cinematic way, you are in the right place. Here on Horovia, we share dark tales that feel real enough to keep you awake at night. Sit back, turn off the lights, and if you'd like to join us for more journeys into the unknown, we'd be happy to have you with us. The night train to Hollow Ridge always left the station with an uneasy silence, as if the steel beast knew the passengers who dared step inside were not the only ones traveling. And when Laura Simmons climbed aboard that evening with her tired eyes and her heavy suitcase, she immediately felt the weight of something unseen pressing against her chest. She had been traveling for work, forced to take this late route after missing the earlier service, and the conductor barely looked at her as she handed him the ticket, his wrinkled hand trembling slightly when their fingers brushed. The carriage smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke, though smoking had been banned for decades. And as she settled into her seat, she realized there were far fewer people aboard than she expected for a route connecting two major cities. A young man in a hoodie hunched over his phone 3 rows ahead. An older woman sat knitting with her lips pressed tightly together, and in the far corner, by the window where the faint reflection of the night glimmered against the glass, a man in a black overcoat sat perfectly still, his face half hidden beneath the shadow of his brimmed hat. Laura tried to ignore him, telling herself not to stare, but something about the way he held his head rigidly forward unsettled her, as if he were waiting for someone to notice. The train lurched forward with a groan of metal, the wheels screeching along the track, and Laura pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. The hum of the fluorescent lights above gave off a faint buzz that seemed to vibrate in her skull. She closed her eyes, but almost immediately she heard it, faint at first but sharp in the silence, a whisper that did not come from the passengers around her. It was a low murmur, like a voice too close to her ear, and when her eyes snapped open, the man in the black overcoat had shifted. His head now slightly turned toward her seat, though his eyes remained hidden beneath the brim of his hat. The whisper stopped, and her heart hammered so violently she pressed her palms against her thighs to keep them from shaking. She told herself she was tired, imagining things. Yet when she glanced at the young man hunched over his phone, she noticed he was staring too, his mouth slightly open, as though he had heard the same thing. The conductor came walking slowly down the aisle, punching tickets with a mechanical click, but as he passed the man in the overcoat, he faltered, his hand shaking so badly he nearly dropped the puncher. Laura saw him swallow, then quickly stepped past, as if he could not bear to stop there. She watched the man in black carefully, waiting to see his reaction, but he sat perfectly still again, his gloved hands resting motionless on his knees. Laura leaned back, pressing her head against the seat, telling herself she would get off at the next stop if she felt this uneasy. But when the train slowed and the lights of a small station flickered briefly outside, no one stood up to leave. The train shuddered, but instead of stopping it accelerated again, the station sliding away into the darkness as though it had never been there at all. Laura frowned, leaning closer to the window, certain this train was scheduled to stop. She glanced around to see if anyone else noticed, but the older woman had frozen mid-stitch, her knitting needles dangling uselessly in her hands, her eyes wide with a silent terror fixed on something behind Laura. Slowly, with every muscle stiffening, Laura turned her head. The man in the overcoat was no longer in his seat. The space where he had been was empty, and the shadow of his body remained faintly against the seat's fabric, as though the weight of him still pressed into it. Laura's throat tightened, her lips parting, but no sound came out. She felt warmth near her ear, a slow, deliberate breath, and then the whisper returned, clearer this time, deep and rasping like gravel dragged across stone. "You should not be here!" She leapt up, her suitcase tumbling into the aisle with a heavy thud, and the young man with the phone bolted upright at the same moment, his device falling from his hands, its screen cracking against the floor. Everyone could hear it now. The whisper had shifted from her ear into the very walls of the carriage, weaving through the flickering lights, vibrating along the windows. The older woman dropped her needles and pressed her palms against her face, whispering prayers too quickly to understand. The conductor appeared again, but this time his face was pale and drenched with sweat. He muttered under his breath, his voice hoarse. I told them not to let him ride." Before Laura could demand answers, the lights snapped off, plunging the carriage into darkness, broken only by the glow of the passing landscape outside. In that brief, strobing illumination, she saw him again, the man in the overcoat, standing in the aisle no more than 3 feet from her, his face still hidden in shadows, but his body towering impossibly tall. Shoulders scraping against the ceiling as if the train could barely contain him. Each time the lightning-like flash of passing signals illuminated his shape, he seemed closer, his head tilting at a grotesque angle. The young man screamed, rushing past Laura, but the dark figure's arm extended unnaturally long, and in the blink of an eye he gripped the boy's shoulder, yanking him into the shadows. The scream cut off instantly, leaving only the sound of the wheels grinding against the tracks and the relentless whisper echoing through every corner of the carriage. Laura staggered back, clutching the seats for support, but when the lights flickered on again, the boy was gone. His phone still lay shattered on the floor, its cracked screen faintly glowing. The conductor had collapsed against the wall, his mouth foaming as his eyes rolled back, and the older woman no longer moved, her body rigid and her eyes glassy, as if something had hollowed her out. Laura knew she had to get out, had to escape, but the windows reflected only her trembling figure and the looming shadow behind her that did not belong. She stumbled toward the connecting door, fumbling with the handle, but it refused to budge. The whisper now grew louder, multiplying into dozens of overlapping voices, all repeating the same dreadful sentence. No one leaves the train. She pounded on the door with both fists until her skin split. But when the door finally jerked open on its own, she saw not another carriage, but a vast corridor stretching endlessly, lined with rows of empty seats, each one filled with faint silhouettes that flickered in and out like static. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind her. The corridor felt alive, the air heavy and pressing against her lungs, and the silhouettes turned their heads in unison, faceless shapes staring without eyes. Laura stumbled backward, but the path she had come from was gone. The train groaned and shook, tilting violently as if derailing, and she collapsed onto the floor. She could hear him approaching, slow and deliberate footsteps echoing from behind. And when she turned, she saw the man in the overcoat striding toward her, his form distorting, bending the air around him. His hat fell back, revealing a face that did not exist, only an endless void where features should have been, sucking the light from the corridor. She tried to scream, but the air in her lungs was stolen, her voice swallowed into the blackness. He bent down, impossibly close, and his whisper filled her head until it became unbearable. You will ride forever. The last thing Laura saw before the world went dark was the window beside her seat in the first carriage, her own reflection staring back at her, seated calmly where she had started, eyes lifeless, lips moving in silent repetition of words she could no longer control. The train thundered on through the night, its passengers trapped, their screams never escaping the endless journey. And somewhere deep within the blackened corridors, the man in the overcoat waited patiently for the next traveler who dared step inside. The train roared forward into the night, the sound of steel screaming against the tracks growing louder, as though the machine itself was crying out in pain. And Laura felt her body being pulled back into her seat, though she had no memory of walking to it, her suitcase gone, her hands folded in her lap, her breath shallow as if she had been there the entire time. She blinked rapidly, disoriented, her head throbbing with the pressure of the voices that still murmured inside her skull. And when she glanced to her left, the young man who had been dragged into the shadows was seated once again, his cracked phone glowing faintly in his hand, but his face was blank. His eyes clouded over with the same lifeless sheen that coated the older woman's stare, and both of them sat silently, bodies rigid, lips moving in unison with words Laura could not hear. The conductor, slumped in the corner, gave a violent jerk, as though a puppet pulled by invisible strings, and then rose to his feet, his mouth opening far wider than it should, as a long, guttural moan poured out that did not sound human. A sound that blended perfectly with the mechanical grinding of the wheels, so that Laura could no longer tell if the noise came from the man or the train itself. She clutched the edge of her seat, her fingernails digging into the fabric until they bent, forcing herself to stand again despite the weight of dread pressing her shoulders down, and stumbled down the aisle, ignoring the frozen passengers who turned their hollow faces toward her in perfect synchrony. She pulled at the door again, but instead of opening into another carriage or the strange endless corridor, it now revealed a stairwell descending into pitch blackness, the scent of wet earth and rotting wood drifting upward. The whispering in her head grew louder, each voice tugging her forward, and though every instinct screamed at her to slam the door shut, her feet moved against her will, carrying her downward step by step into the suffocating dark. Her hands brushed against the cold, damp wall as she descended, and she realized with mounting horror that there should not be a stairwell inside a moving train. The steps led her into a chamber lit faintly by a swinging lantern that burned with a sickly green flame. And around her stretched rows of old wooden benches bolted into the walls, as if this hidden belly of the train had been designed to carry more passengers long ago. Passengers who were no longer human. Figures sat hunched along the benches, their faces hidden by veils of shadow, but she could see their bodies twitching and hear the wet sound of their breathing. As she stepped into the chamber, the lantern stilled, and every figure raised its head in unison. There were no eyes, no mouths, no features at all. Only smooth, blank skin stretched tight where faces should be, and yet Laura felt dozens of stares piercing her soul. Her throat closed, and she staggered backward, but behind her, the stairwell had vanished, leaving only a solid steel wall that vibrated with the pulse of the moving train. A figure rose from the benches, taller than the rest, its limbs unnaturally long, and it moved toward her with jerks and spasms like a marionette handled by a drunken puppeteer. With each step, its blank face began to bulge, indentations forming as if something inside was pressing outward, trying to break free, and when it was inches from her, it let out a groan that rose into a shriek, splitting the air and rattling the lantern so violently it nearly fell from its chain. Laura dropped to her knees, covering her ears. But the scream was not only sound, it was inside her, rattling through her bones until her teeth chattered. She looked up, trembling, and saw a crack split open in the center of the blank face, revealing a mouth far too wide, filled with teeth that did not look human but jagged like shards of broken glass. The mouth moved soundlessly, But inside her head, the whisper returned, stronger than ever, commanding her with cruel clarity. "Stay." Laura bolted, running blindly between the benches, her hands brushing against the twitching bodies that reached for her with claw-like fingers. She burst through another door at the far end of the chamber and found herself back in the main carriage where she had first sat, the knitting woman still holding her needles mid-stitch, the boy bent over his cracked phone, the conductor twitching by the door. For a fleeting second, she believed she had imagined everything, some kind of waking nightmare born from exhaustion. But then she saw the man in the overcoat once again seated calmly in his corner, hat pulled low, gloved hands resting on his knees. Her stomach lurched. She could not breathe. His presence poisoned the air, made the light above flicker and dim, and though his face was still hidden, she knew he was smiling at her. The train screeched as it entered a tunnel, darkness swallowing the windows until nothing but her own reflection stared back at her. But as she leaned closer, she saw that it was not her reflection at all. It was her body, yes, her hair and her clothes, but the eyes were gone, replaced by black pits, and the mouth moved on its own, whispering the same phrase over and over. "You will never leave." She stumbled back, colliding with the seat behind her. And when she turned, every passenger in the carriage had risen. They stood in the aisle, blocking her path, their lifeless faces tilted toward her in unison, their lips moving together in a chant that grew louder and louder until it drowned out the sound of the train itself. She screamed for help, begged anyone to stop, but they pressed closer, surrounding her, and above their heads she saw the shadow of the man in the overcoat, towering taller than all of them, his presence stretching across the entire length of the carriage like a second skin. The lights burst, plunging everything into darkness, and for a moment there was only silence, complete and suffocating. Then, a single cold hand wrapped around her wrist, pulling her upward so violently she felt her shoulder tear. She dangled in the blackness, weightless, and realized she was no longer inside the train at all. She hung suspended in an endless void where faint outlines of rusted tracks stretched in every direction, fading into the darkness. Around her floated carriages, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, all attached to nothing, drifting through the void with faint yellow lights glowing in their windows. Through those windows she saw faces, thousands of them, screaming silently, pounding against the glass, but none escaping. The man in the overcoat rose out of the darkness beneath her, impossibly vast now, his brimmed hat casting a shadow that swallowed entire trains. He raised his faceless head, and the void inside him pulled at her, dragging her closer with a force she could not resist. His voice was no longer a whisper, but a thunderous command that shook the endless night. "You ride until the end of time." She tried to fight, clawing at his grip, kicking at nothing. But her body grew heavier and heavier, as though her soul itself was being chained. She felt herself slipping, felt her voice torn away, and in that last instant before she was swallowed whole, she saw something far worse. In the reflection of his void, she saw herself already seated in one of the drifting carriages, her face blank, her eyes gone, her lips chanting in silence with the others. She realized with unbearable clarity that she had already become one of them, that this endless ride had always been her fate the moment she stepped aboard, and the man in the overcoat had simply been waiting for her to accept it. Her final scream was devoured before it could leave her lips, and then there was only the roar of the train, eternal, carrying the souls of countless passengers who never